August 10th, 1628, was a calm day in Stockholm, and crowds had lined the shore to watch the belated first voyage of the ascendant Swedish Empire's greatest ship, the Vasa. Brightly colored and trumpeting the prestige of King Gustav II, with 64 guns, the Vasa was the most powerful ship anywhere in the world. But as the great ship's sails caught wind, it teetered hard to port, and the shouts of the sailors turned to screams. In front of hundreds of spectators and agents of other European governments, the Swedish Empire's greatest ship sank after only sailing some 1,400 yards. The tragedy of the Vasa deserves to be remembered.
Sweden in the Middle Ages was sparsely populated and its power relatively marginal compared to the great states of Europe. But under capable leadership and reform, the nation would transform into one of the first modern European governments. Sweden suddenly became one of the most powerful states in the Baltic and an important player in European politics. Dubbed the era of great power by Swedish historians, Sweden rapidly became highly militarized and grew to its greatest territorial extent. Likely the most important figure in Sweden's rise was King Gustavus Adolphus, known as King Gustav II Adolf or Gustavus Adolphus the Great. When Gustav was born in 1594, Sweden was ruled by his cousin Sigismund III, who was also King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania. In 1599, Gustav's father deposed Sigismund from the Swedish throne, at least in part because Sweden was Protestant and Sigismund staunchly Catholic. Upon his father's death in 1611, 16-year-old Gustav became King of Sweden and was declared of age to rule for himself in December after he turned 17. The young king was faced with multiple ongoing wars. His father, Charles IX, had invaded Russia in an attempt to install a czar and had instigated a war with neighbor Denmark-Norway, which was then under a single monarch. Most pressing, however, was the ongoing conflict with Poland-Lithuania, as Sigismund never gave up pressing his claim to the Swedish throne. Sweden's various foes, however, would find that they faced a formidable adversary in Gustav. Gustav achieved mixed results in his earliest years, losing ground in a treaty with Denmark but cutting Russia off from the Baltic Sea. Perhaps most importantly, he worked with Sweden's aristocracy to transform the government. Sweeping reforms centralized administration and increased efficiency, delegating important work to new government departments. He is most remembered for transforming the military. He created a standing army, pioneered combined arms strategies using mobile infantry companies supported by mobile artillery and cavalry. American military historian Theodore Dodge called Gustav the father of modern warfare, and American Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Redmond wrote in a 2000 paper that the most prolific revolutionary but least well-known captain of military history was Gustav Adolphus. Gustav is still studied in modern military strategy programs.
Gustav also sought to improve his navy, although to a lesser extent than he did the army.
Among the first government departments organized under Gustav II was the Naval Department, which was put under an admiral of the realm. The new department consolidated shipbuilding into two main centers and delegated actual construction to private entrepreneurs who leased the shipyards. He also hoped to build bigger and better ships. Most of Sweden's ships in 1620 had single gun decks and were armed largely with 12-pounder cannons. Navies around Europe were then experimenting with ships of greater firepower by adding a second gun deck, but the mechanics of such construction were still generally unknown. As early as 1619, Gustav had sought a larger ship, but a ship contracted with Dutch shipbuilders failed to materialize. Negotiations to build larger ships began in the fall of 1620. The Stockholm shipyard contract was given to two Dutch brothers, Henrik and Arent Heibertsen. Henrik was a master shipwright who had worked in Sweden for 20 years, and Arent was a successful merchant in the Baltic. The contracts ordered 4 ships, 2 similar to already existing ships and 2 much larger ones. Vasa was meant to be 128 feet long at the keel and displace about 1,210 tons. 2 slightly different versions of the contract for the ship were signed, one by the Admiralty in 1624 and the other by the King in January 1625. The 2 contracts caused problems as they had slightly different measurements for the 2 larger ships as well as different agreed prices. The name Vasa came later in construction and referred to the king's house, which in turn was named after the sheaf of wheat on their heraldic symbol. The wheat, originally a bundle of sticks, is a reference to an ancient Roman symbol of leadership. Vasa would be incredibly well armed. 72 24-pounder bronze cannons were ordered, a huge number for the period. To fit all the guns, Vasa would have 2 gun decks. While some ships with 2 gun decks had been built in Europe, it was an incredibly new design, and Henrik had never built anything like it. The engineering problems were acute. 2 gun decks meant more weight above the waterline, and the lower gun deck would sit perilously close to the waterline. As the Dutch brothers collected materials and struggled to find sufficient labor, nearly 300 people would work at the shipyard, complications were quickly arising. War with Poland-Lithuania flared repeatedly in the 1600s, and in 1625 Gustav was again fighting in Poland. Disaster struck the Navy when 10 ships, nearly a third of the Swedish Navy, were wrecked in a storm in the Bay of Riga. To replace the lost ships, Gustav suddenly ordered Henrik to build 2 medium ships of sizes between the ships already contracted, but Henrik refused, eventually forcing the king to accept the original designs. The event has led to an enduring myth that Gustav, who was not a shipwright, changed the designs mid-construction, either making the ship longer or ordering the addition of a second gun deck. The myth even spawned the term Vasa syndrome, a business term referring to management and communication problems in a project that caused it to fail. Frederick Hocker, archaeologist, historian, and director of the Vasa Museum, argues that there is no evidence that this was the case, as arguments about dimension ended before the construction began. Most notably, he adds, the ship itself provides no evidence for substantial changes after construction began. The keel was laid in early 1626, but Henrik became ill and handed over much of the construction to another shipwright by the summer of 1626. The lower part of the ship was built ashore, but it was launched in the spring of 1627 to have the upper decks built afloat. Henrik died around the same time, and the ship fell behind schedule, eventually receiving its cannons a year later. The foundry struggled to fill the order for bronze cannons. Heating enough bronze was time-consuming, and each mold was handmade and destroyed during casting. The small foundry simply didn't have the manpower to make the 72 cannons in time. Any failed casts had to be recast, and by the spring of 1628, they could only deliver 56 guns, 8 short of an amended order for 64. The remaining 8 guns were older and smaller designs. Ordering new cannons for the ship itself was innovative. While ships had been carrying gunpowder weapons for several centuries, the cannons themselves lasted longer than any ship and were reused on other ships. In practice, this meant that most ships had a large variety of different-sized cannon and needed a variety of ammunition. Standardizing the size was significantly more efficient. In general, standard ship strategy was to use ships as transports and in combat to close with the enemy and board. Capturing the enemy ship meant captains didn't want to damage the other ship too badly, so guns were used sparingly. The ship was highly ornamented and lavishly decorated to represent the power and prestige of the Swedish kingdom. The central focus was the king himself and his claim on the throne. The figurehead would be a lion, while at the rear of the boat the heraldic symbol would be the dominant image. Stories of the ancient Goths and Roman Empire would be included, as would a representation of the Old Testament story of Gideon, who the king identified with. Knights, cherubs, and the king himself decorated the transom at the boat's stern, representing Gustav's claim over Sigismund's. Over 700 sculptures, figurines, and ornaments decorated the ship in all. They were an orgy of pink-nailed flesh, of steel-blue armor, of sanguine reds, of poisonous greens, and marine blues. Several other carvings were crude jokes at the expense of the enemy, primarily the Poles. Several Polish nobles were carved on the deck under heavy cranes, ostensibly crushed by the weight. Even more insulting, they could only be fully seen when one was sitting on the ship's toilets. Vasa was meant to be the flagship of a small reserve fleet, which would be based at a fleet base in the Stockholm archipelago. After Henrik's death in the spring of 1627, the Navy had sent their own representative to oversee the ship, but the captain was busy and had delegated the work to others. Already some were concerned about the ship. It rolled too easily in the water, which made it difficult to rig. Even where the rigging was set on the deck could cause the ship to lean precipitously in one direction or another. In the summer of 1628, the captain in charge demonstrated to Admiral Fleming how crank the ship was by having 30 men run back and forth over the deck to make the ship roll. According to a witness, the admiral had ordered them to stop and said, "I wish His Majesty was home." In fact, the king likely only visited the ship once, months earlier in January of 1628. The king was impatient for the ship, already well behind schedule, to take to the sea, which seems to have discouraged lower leadership to voice their concerns. 120 tons of ballast had been stowed in the ship. Apparently not enough, but during the inquest, the shipmaster claimed that there was not room for 1 stone more. And even if more could be added, it would bring the gun ports too close to the water. The ship finally left port on August 10th, 1628, to great fanfare. Around 4 p.m., it led off, slowly sailing along the shore. The guns fired a salute. The sails were lowered, and the ship turned to follow the shoreline as it left the harbor. The captain was well aware of the ship's tendencies and likely hoped he could figure out how to balance the ship with weight distribution after sailing her. While the cannons were secured below deck, the lower gun ports were not closed as the ship met its first fairly light gust of wind. The ship leaned but righted itself safely. The captain breathed a sigh of relief, but the biggest test was yet to come. As the ship passed the cliffs on its right, the wind would pick up. Just as expected, the wind hit the ship, and almost immediately the captain knew there was a problem. He attempted to order men below to close the gun ports, but it was too late. Water was pouring in, and the ship wasn't righting itself. It kept leaning. About 150 people were on board, including the crew's women and children, and screams soon filled the air. The ship seems to have sunk fast. One survivor recalled that by the time I came up from the lower deck, the water had risen so high that the staircase had come loose, and it was only with great difficulty that I climbed out. As the ship slipped beneath the water, smaller boats trailing rescued survivors. Reports from the initial sinking varied widely, but the most reliable suggest that about 30 people died with the ship. When the king learned of the disaster, he was furious, and an inquest had already been ordered to find someone to blame. Crewmen admitted that they knew the ship had a tendency to roll, but no one had voiced any concern, while all claimed that they were not shipbuilders and did not know why Vasa sunk. Several offered their own opinions that the upper works were too heavy and that the ship's hull was too narrow. The inquest fell hardest on the builders. Why did you build the ship so narrow, so badly, and without enough bottom that it capsized? The prosecutor asked Henrik's brother Arent and the shipwright who had replaced them. They insisted that they had built the ship according to the design given to me and approved by the king. Asked why the ship sank, Arent said God only knows. Ultimately, the only person to receive blame for the disaster was Henrik himself, already dead a year and unable to defend himself. Few ships of the time had particularly good balance, as tools for calculating the stability were years away, but Vasa did not have an especially bad hull shape. The real problem, says Frederick Hocker, director of the Vasa Museum, was weight distribution. The upper decks used heavy wood, and the gun decks were too tall. There was simply not enough weight below decks to balance the ship. According to Hocker, her design simply meant that she would never have been a good ship.
Well, certainly it was an embarrassment. The sinking of the Vasa was not a total disaster for Sweden. With altered designs, her sister ship Apple and other ships served well in the years that followed. Poland never did have a fleet that could challenge that of Sweden, and Sweden's most illustrious years lay ahead, when the king entered the 30 Years' War and earned his invincible reputation.
Her construction was, however, an important event, both for its failure and for the incredible wealth and power that she represented, if somewhat ironically. Her design and the new ship warfare that it represented were well ahead of their time. Its ambition and the remarkable condition of the wreck had turned the ship into a symbol of Sweden and her past prestige.
While most of Vasa's guns were recovered, despite efforts, the ship remained at the bottom of the harbor, where the cold and brackish water kept out shipworms. It was finally pulled from the depths in 1961 in extraordinary condition, and since then researchers have built a museum around the remarkably preserved ship, which has proven a boon for archaeologists. It is the only fully intact 17th century warship to have been recovered, and it still represents the grandest ambitions of one of the great kingdoms of the era. The museum is among the most popular in Europe. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.